Shalom, everybody. We are coming to you from Ema's Basement again here on this venerable day of the sun. And we wanted to talk to you briefly about a subject that we're seeing kind of creeping its way into the Hebrew roots community or Messianic community. And it's there's a broader movement afoot in the Messianic community to sort of, for lack of a better phrase or term, make the Messianic community a kinder, gentler Messianic community, because we've had a tendency to question things, and being in human nature, we can disagree and sometimes passionately and strongly disagree. This particular message being put out is troubling to us, and we wanted to address it because it's a retread of an old prosperity, purpose-driven megachurchianity message that's being put forth by a certain evangelist who we won't name. And the aim of it largely seems to want to shame those in the Messianic and Hebrew roots movement back into churchianity. And it starts off, and it really hinges upon a certain construction of Matthew 24 from the Olivet Discourse. And it starts out really with Matthew 24, verse 4.
And Matthew 24, verse 4 is, "And Jesus answered and said unto them," he's talking about the disciples here. He's just really, if you look at Matthew chapter 23, just to set the stage for where we're at, he's just come back and told them that verily I say all things shall become upon this generation of Jerusalem, and he talks about the prophets and talks about things being destroyed. And so in Matthew 24, the disciples are looking at him and saying, well, when will these things happen? And that's the context for how we start Matthew 24, and the verse that is being used to kind of put forth the concept of the misuse of the word offense. And it says, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed, no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." And we're going to look here at a couple of things. We're going to look at offense, and we're going to look at Christ, because Christ is the Greek, from the Greek Christos, which simply means anointed, and that's going to be the key to part of what we're getting ready to discuss.
Now, interestingly, when you hear it preached, even in the Messianic Hebrew roots settings, presenters are using it in terms of defining what that "I am the Christ" means by using kind of the common teaching that we've seen in our movement now, by trying to say, well, that the person presenting is going to acknowledge that Yeshua is the Messiah, but they'll still deceive people. And certainly that's a fair interpretation of that. But as we unpack these verses in scriptures, we're going to actually, I think, find that this particular prophecy has for a number of years been getting fulfilled right in front of our eyes. And we haven't fully understood that and recognized that. So that's something that, as we go through these scriptures, we want to delve into and study. And does it, I'm assuming we continue and go into Matthew 24.
Well, verse 4 and 5, and now going on verse 6, and again, he's talking about what kind of things are going to happen. How are you going to know when these things are going to happen? And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye not be troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in divers places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. And then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another.
And this really is the fulcrum moment for those messages. First of all, it's worthy of noting that the message that we're talking about depends upon a King James Bible translation and teaching because it contains the use of the word offense. And the key of that is to convince the audience that Yeshua is telling his disciples that in the end times there's going to be a massive case of hurt feelings that breaks out amongst the church and the believers, and people will be angry with each other. And that really makes it the key of what I want to call the verbal sleight of hand in that particular message. We see that because what's really going on in Matthew 29 up to this point and in the verses coming forth, we see people being delivered up to be tortured, to be killed. There's famines, there's pestilence. The world almost universally hates these believers. And yet at some point we're to construe that within the midst of that, even more so, is perhaps this offense among the brethren and believers. And okay, I get that point, but there is perhaps a deeper understanding that we have to look at.
And if you go on to Matthew 11, it says, "And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many." So again, if you're going back to my namesake, I am the Christ, now we're talking about false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, and the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And you know, Christ is talking, this is all one discourse. So all these things need to line up and make sense. He's not changing subjects midfield. Mm-hmm. So...
Well, and really what I call the barb of the hook for that particular teaching and message is found in verse 13. Because the teachers that give this message, they take this verse and they say, "He that shall endure to the end shall be saved." This is your key to survival and getting into heaven. This is your ticket. And they say, endure what? Because endure doesn't give you're enduring what? Well, you know, goodness gracious, you've got afflictions, killings, starvations, different things up there, but we're not to believe that. We're to say that it's the person who is to endure the hard feelings created by the offense that is to be saved. And here's where the coin gets changed, shall we say, in the teaching. It then becomes this teaching of unforgiveness between people in the church. And that if you harbor unforgiveness, you won't be saved. And what that means, as examples that get used, are effectively, if you get tired of hearing Scripture routinely misquoted in your church, and you leave to find a place where they teach Scripture right, you're not going to get into heaven and be saved because you haven't overcome your offense. If you're offended or tired of seeing musical marriage beds within your church, meaning one week you come in and it's Jill and Jim and Bob and Sue sitting on either side of you, and then the next week the same people are there but the spouses shift, and you decide that maybe that's not a right spirit for you to be around to keep your marriage intact, you're not going to make it into heaven because you haven't overcome your offenses, and you won't be saved because you didn't endure to the end. Then, of course, you've got the examples of if you get sick of hearing about how the law was done away with, you won't be saved because you couldn't overcome that offense. If you get sick of learning really what the true meaning of Easter was, and seeing the sale of Easter eggs and the collaring and the Easter bunnies in your church, you're not going to be saved because you didn't overcome that. If you question the sanctimonious rebuke of Halloween, and perhaps rightly so because it being a pagan holiday, and see the church embrace Christmas as if it is not a pagan holiday. Well, you can't get into heaven either. You're not going to be saved because you didn't really endure that. If you cringe at a prosperity message, you can't be saved. It's, you've got all this offense, all these things that have annoyed you mean Messianics and you mean Hebrew roots people and caused you to leave the church. You just need to repent and get back into Sunday church.
And in saying all this, I'm assuming you're not saying that we shouldn't practice forgiveness.
No, we certainly should forgive, but we don't check our common sense at the door of the church, and that would be my point. And
it's not, and this offense isn't about whether or not we forgive one another. The use here in the scripture is something different.
Well, here's where you see the hypocrisy in such a message. Do the very preachers that are out here preaching to the laity, and I'll use the term laity here.
Laity meaning?
The masses, the unlearned people sitting from on the other side of the elevated pulpit, do they even practice this? No. And how do we know this? How many of these same preachers love to quote Ephesians 4:26 in part and say, be angry but sin not. And I got angry about this, or I got angry about that. How many, go on YouTube and see how many of these preachers are out here throwing out the phrase in a almost fire coming out their nose of touch not God's anointed in an angry way. And this particular preacher that I've heard give this message has one at one of his conferences where he's incredibly critical of a man who questioned his teachings and his thought process, and every other word when referring to this guy was, go pump gas. You need to stop preaching. You shouldn't question my teachings. I've got 180,000 hours of Bible teaching, notwithstanding the fact that 7 years earlier I had 60,000 hours, do the math. And, he's being critical. We all get angry. We all get offended at different things. And if we are talking about the kind of offense that says, I'm mad at you, I'm unfriending you, and unblocking you on Facebook, heaven is going to be a very lonely place. And that's really what I want to say there with it, because I think these men are, in giving this message, it is a Nicolaitan tactic that is being used by largely the televangelist types who have multi-million-dollar 990s tied to their ministries to the extent they haven't declared them all churches and no longer have to declare those. And they are violating these things. They're lording over the laity. They violate really the basic precepts of Matthew 23, which is the verses where Yeshua explained to us, we've got one master, Him.
That's right.
We've got one rabbi, Him. We've got one Father, Yehovah. Mm-hmm. We're all brothers and sisters to each other. And these preachers that give this message, they may be sincere people and sincerely misunderstanding what they're doing, but the last time I looked, they put their pants on one leg at a time, the same as I do. And this whole idea that somehow I should just sit down because I'm rocking the boat,
or because they've got so many hours
or
of
because
teaching they need to tell you about.
putatively got so many hours of Bible teaching, they have to brag about it. It is just, to me, it's wrong, and it's frightening, because the subtle message with this, let me use Matthew 24 to talk about offenses and unforgiveness, is really telling the people out here, don't question me, don't question what I teach, just sit down, shut up, and write your checks.
Well, and if we start back with Matthew 23 for a second, and it talks about, this is where Yeshua says, call no man rabbi. And I think that's really his underscore of, don't elevate one of you above the other. None of you is able to be above the other. Only Yeshua is able to be above us, with the obvious exception that women are subservient to their husbands. But the idea of putting men on pedestals and somehow saying that they're somehow greater, we're all charged with working out our salvation, our own salvation, with fear and trembling. We're all responsible for doing that on our own. We have Bibles. We have the ability to study. We don't need necessarily to just completely rely on without checking and without looking what anyone else says, including what you and I would say.
And I would say, you know, just to back up, although that's a different teaching, and I don't think it was your intent when you said it, I would not say that women are to be subservient to the households. We have that quote out of Corinthians that talks about the man as the head of the house and Yeshua as the head of the church. But I think largely when we talk about that, we are talking about that in terms of accountability to God.
Exactly.
And the responsibility side, not the lording over as in, you know,
right.
I shall have only the remote and you shall not, or something similar to that. And I think that's an important aspect to note, that it is first and foremost, when Yeshua comes to talk to a household, he's going to look first to the man.
Right.
But everybody will give account.
But as far as humans on this earth, there is not, we shouldn't be putting one human above another.
Absolutely not.
And I think that's what he was going to when he said, don't call people rabbi. Of course, he didn't say call him preacher or don't call him pastor, because those terms really weren't being used at that time because of this, where the church was at. But I think the concept is still there. And then you go on to Matthew 24:5, and this was a conversation actually that came out of a conversation you and I had some time ago, and it goes back to what I said earlier. For so many shall come at my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many, or saying, I am the anointed. So do they claim to be Yeshua returned to earth? No, this is, when I first read this as a young Christian, said, I am the Christ, I'm thinking the Antichrist. There's going to be many people who are going to come and they're going to say, I'm Jesus, like the Branch Davidians and those things. And we do have those people.
It's going to be the greatest case of identity theft that ever occurred.
Exactly. So, however, when you understand the word Christ means anointed, and particularly if you look at it in the scope of the Old Testament, who were the anointed? The anointed were, David was anointed. Saul was anointed. There was a particular thing that happened, and God would say, go anoint this person, and they would be anointed, meaning that the oil was put over, it was a whole ceremony. They weren't all necessarily, Christ or trying to be Messiah, but they were being anointed. And Christ, or Christos in the Greek, is Messiah in the Hebrew. So, in fact, just as a side real quick, one of the things you have to be careful when you call Messianic is you can have different people Messianic because they can believe Moses was Messiah, and that's Messianic. So, my point being is Christ can be anointed, can be a very common word, a very common term. And if you understand that, they don't necessarily have to claim to be Yeshua. They don't even have to claim to be
the Messiah.
The Mashiach, only that they are the anointed. In other words, they like to couple this phrase with the Old Testament when David was with Saul and he said, don't touch God's anointed, I'm not going to kill God's anointed. Saul was not, at that point in particular, a particularly righteous man. He was simply had been anointed because Samuel literally anointed him under the instructions of Yehovah.
Well, and it seems like we see this in particularly the Pentecostal movement very much, where we see a preacher that comes along and says, I am an anointed preacher, or they get announced as, I am an anointed messenger or preacher. And if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, it sounds like every preacher that really gets up and stands in a pulpit and says, I'm an anointed preacher, is effectively coming in the name of Yeshua and saying, I am the Christ.
Well, exactly.
Or I am Christ, not even I am the Christ.
Yeah, I am. Basically, if you wanted to take the word Christ and make it into our common English, it would be, for many shall come in my name saying, I am anointed, and shall deceive many. And it's interesting, if you look at this in the Amplified Bible, which I happened to pulled out, it says, for many will come in on the strength of my name, appropriating the name which belongs to me, saying I am and it says I am the Messiah, but if it really could just be I am anointed. I am operating, Yehovah anointed me, and you need to listen to me because I'm like Moses. I mean, that's really what they're saying, because remember with Moses, the people said, we don't want to listen to Yehovah, you tell Moses what to do and we'll do it. I mean, that's what they're saying. And do they deceive people with their teaching? Absolutely. Some of it I think is unintentional, some of it I think is intentional, and some of it's with just a complete disregard because perhaps they've got a whole lot of DVDs out there that they need to sell. And if they come back and say, for example, that, well, I was wrong, the Torah isn't done away with, a lot of their merchandise may not be very profitable. So you look at how they twist these definitions into, and what is Yeshua warning us about? Remember, he's talking about the end of times, and this is the first thing he says. Watch out. There's going to be people coming, and they're going to be appropriating me and saying, I am the anointed.
Well, and one way that they would appropriate somebody is they would sail into town from several hundred miles away. They would come into the local congregation of a church, and they would say, I'm anointed. It seems like that's the way that they would go.
So you look at Matthew 24:9, 10 through 9. They say they shall deliver you up to be afflicted. They shall kill you. They will, shall hate it of all nations for my name's sake. And then many shall be offended and betray one another. So this sounds like something a whole lot more than hurt feelings.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if you look at what's going on here, if we're talking about hurt feelings, look at the Holocaust. Look at even Yeshua's disciples. People can act different ways in those contexts, and we can discuss it as we get into really the proper definition of offend as it's used in the New Testament. But when people turned people in to save their skin in the Holocaust, did they harbor the people they were turning in any ill will necessarily? No, they were just trying to survive. If a plane crashes and the plane's burning up and you're trying to get out of the plane and you're in complete survival mode, is it personal that somebody's stepping on another person to get out? It might be to the person that's getting stepped on, but the person that's doing it is not offended at the other person. They're just narrowly focused.
Well, exactly. I mean, those types of things become minuscule in your mind in the sense that we're just trying to survive. I got more important things to worry about than whether or not you unfriended me on Facebook 2 years ago. I mean, I'm now in a situation where I'm looking at my family. I'm trying to save my family. I'm trying to save the people that I love and I care about. I'm in survival mode. Mm-hmm. And this is the context where it's talking about many shall be offended. And I know you did some research then on what the word offended means, because in English we know offended can really mean a couple things. One is what we've been talking about, the offense of you hurt my feelings. But there's another way that in English we can talk about the word offense.
Well, and the word that's actually used here comes out of the Greek in the New Testament, scandalizo. And it is properly to set a snare, a stumbling block, figuratively to hinder right conduct or thought, or to cause to stumble, or to cause somebody to stumble or fall into a trap. It really is not so much about the, shall we say, the emotional side of things as much as the behavioral side of things. In other words, in criminal law, we refer to those who have violated the terms of the criminal laws of our society as offenders. And we can actually say that, they have offended the laws of the state that we have and that we live on. So, when we're talking about these situations here, when people leave the faith, they fall away from the faith. Mm-hmm. They offend in terms of violating the Torah. They have sinned and left the faith in those circumstances. And in fact, there are 29 uses of scandalizo in the King James Bible in the New Testament, and only 4 of those refer to any type of hurt feelings. And in Matthew 24, it is universally referring to falling away in looking at it. And the way that you can look at this is, In the Beatitudes, where Yeshua talks about if your eye makes you stumble, or if your eye offend thee, you pluck it out. It's talking about if an eye causes you to stumble or to sin. It's not talking about if your eye, I'm mad at my eye, I'm blocking my eye on
Yeah.
Facebook.
It offended me. I didn't like it today. It was,
Matthew 5:30, the same thing, your right hand, same word, same use. Matthew 11:6 talks about where Yeshua's sending word back to John. And it talks about he that shall not be offended. I mean, in other words, if I don't cause you to fall away, blessed are you. And in Matthew 13:21, it talked about that they receive the word and they're offended. They fall away. Immediately he falls away. Now, when Yeshua interacted with the Pharisees in Matthew 13:57 and Matthew 15:12, that's where he said things to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were angered at him, and so you get that. The same thing in Matthew 17:27, where he talks about going and paying the taxes lest we offend them. But then you get back into it again with the others. Matthew 18:6, Matthew 18:8, just go on and go through it. Mark, John, get into Corinthians where Paul's talking about it, where food causes a brother to stumble. It can say offend. And the same thing in all of Corinthians where offense is used. It's talking about leading people into sin. The same thing with offending these little ones. It's leading them into sin or causing them to stray away from the straight and narrow.
well, and I think it makes then, if you go back into the context of Matthew 24, it makes a whole lot more sense because you go into 10 and reading it the way we now understand it. And then it says, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and shall hate one another, and ye shall hate one another, all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many fall away, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end shall be saved. In other words, he who does not fall away, who endures all of these things, who gets through all this really bad stuff that they're going to have to go through.
An example that I give that probably is the closest to Yeshua, when he was crucified, when he was hanging on the cross, 10 of his 12 disciples weren't there. They had left. They had fell away.
Yeah.
They had been offended in him that night in the sense that they bailed on him. Peter denied him 3 times. Now, did Peter go out and block him on Facebook? Was Peter mad at him? No. Peter was saying, hey, I'm not going to let this happen. He was right with him, but he went into fight or flight survival mode.
Right.
His brains checked out at that particular moment. And he left, and he wept bitterly even as he's denying him. What brings him back to his senses at that moment is when the cock crowed after he denied him 3 times. And he weeps bitterly as he goes away because suddenly he realizes Yeshua told me this. And he's gone, and he's ashamed until Yeshua brings him back into the fold. And, it wasn't any anger or anything like that. That came forth. And by the same token, are we to understand with the way that this message is being presented to us by these preachers, are we to understand that if we somehow endure through the tribulation and we see our loved ones killed,
right,
we see them slaughtered, and Yeshua's going to come back in the clouds after we've made it all, we've not taken the mark of the beast, we've survived, we've endured that, and he's going to look at us and say, I'm sorry, you've got to get in the lake of fire too, because you were mad at all those people that did that to your loved ones and your family. You got offended.
Your feelings got hurt.
I mean, really, if that's the case, it just does not make logical sense. And I submit, it doesn't make logical sense because it's a verbal sleight of hand designed to shame the laity into submission, and particularly is very dangerous when it's worked and allowed to creep into the Hebrew roots messianic movement, who has been willing to stand up and say, no, That's not what Scripture says. I'm sorry, I respectfully disagree.
And it's through knowing that Torah, and it's through being able to stand at times and say, no, I disagree, that I think is going to give us the backbone and the tools that will help us be able to endure and to not be offended.
Well, I mean, and we could do a whole nother teaching with it all, but it really, take heed that no man deceive you.
Exactly.
You know, what were the two deceptions that really came in through that very message? The one deception is, I'm an anointed preacher, I am the Christ.
Right.
The second one is this definition of offend, so that we just hunker down and yes sir, 3 bags full, let's
Right.
take another. And we don't question, as the very teaching here in Matthew 24 talks about, we don't raise up when some of the prophecies these same
Right.
preachers give never ever come to pass. And we don't look at them and say, hey, Deuteronomy 18:22, take your place on the wall, buddy.
Well, and the other kind of presumption that gets made when particularly it was delivered at this particular conference that we that we were at, was the presupposition of, I left the church because I was hurt, my feelings were hurt and I was offended. And I just want to go on record saying I never left the Sunday church because I was mad at anybody in the Sunday church. There are a lot of good people still in the Sunday church. I left the Sunday church because we had a conviction on keeping the Sabbath and keeping the Torah.
Well, and call it whatever you want to call it. I get offended at sitting down there and having to wait for the error to come across. Now, whether that's emotional, angry, whatever, you know, there comes a point where I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
if you want to say I'm mad about it and I left, well, whatever. No, I mean, I see the preachers, the people still out on the street. They're great folks.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to say, well, you know, they didn't even shake my hand. No, they shook my hand. They shook my right hand and I held my wallet with my left hand. And it is what it is.
But my point is not everyone left Hebrew Roots because they had their feelings hurt or anything like that. I know some people, but that we came out of sincere convictions about what we believed, and really some of this presumes that that's not the case.
Well, I think that is a dated message with a dated mindset to a lot of extent, in the sense that years ago, a lot of people realized, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't add up in the church.
Right.
So I'm just leaving, and since it doesn't add up in the church, and since I can't stay in the church anymore without screaming to the top of my lungs, I must be no good as a Christian, and I just need to give up on God. If you do that, that's a mistake.
Well, that's
The
the offense.
That's the Hebrew roots. However, people don't fall away. They draw closer to
That's
God.
right.
And, you know, they're looking, saying, okay, I can't handle it here anymore because I'm going to charge the platform and lock my hands around the pastor's neck for giving that message in love. But I've got to find another place where I can continue to serve Yehovah, where I can continue to try to make a difference, to learn, to draw near, to help disciple people, right, without being in this environment that I'm in. And I'm like you, I don't view that as an offense in the sense we haven't fell away.
No, we're still, if anything, I feel closer to y'all than I've ever felt.
And, you know, really with that, I encourage people. I think really Revelation 18:4 is the bellwether for the time we're living in with the church. I think a lot of people look at Revelation 18:4 in the Protestant movement, and they say, there's what God tells everybody in the Catholic Church. And, you know, with current events being what they are, okay, I can see that to a point, but every church out here that is a Sunday church, that is into Christmas, that is into Easter, is a Catholic church. They are a little daughter of the woman on the beast in Revelation 17. And therefore, really, Revelation 18:4 is a call to all people who are serious about getting into the book and being a part of the remnant, being those that keep the commands of Yehovah and have the testimony of Yeshua, not either or, and to come out of her before they partake of her plagues that are to come.
I agree, and I think with that, I think we've covered, and that's Charlie and Jen and the Torah Tater. Bidding
Special
you,
thanks to Larry on the camera,
yeah, and
and bidding everybody a shalom.
shalom and happy Hanukkah.
Okay.